June the 7th, 1896. As dawn broke over the Nile, 9,000 men moved in for the attack. They had just marched through the moonless desert in complete silence. Their target? A fortified village held by 3,000 Mahdist warriors, who'd just finished their morning prayers and had no idea what was about to hit them. This is the story of the Battle of Firket, also called Ferkeh, a masterclass in planning and execution that was General Kitchener's opening move in the reconquest of Sudan. Despite claims in the British press, the Anglo-Egyptian invasion or reconquest of Sudan had little to do with avenging General Charles Gordon, who had been killed by the Mahdists in Khartoum over a decade beforehand. Nor was it in response to a Sudanese Mahdist threat to Egypt and Britain's interests in that country, not least the Suez Canal. That threat had been blunted by General Grenfell at the Battle of Toski in 1888. It had a lot more to do with two other European powers. In March 1896, the Italians had suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Adawa in Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia. Within a week, the Italian ambassador in London was practically begging the British to create a diversion in Sudan to prevent the Mahdists taking advantage of their weakness and invading their colony in Eritrea. At the same time, the British were becoming aware that the French were taking an interest in the Sudan to unite their vast colonial empire in the west of Africa with their colony on the Red Sea coast. Now, if they did that, they would prevent the British connecting Egypt with their own imperial territories in East and Southern Africa. And indeed, imperialist Cecil Rhodes had advocated a railway running the full length of Africa from Cape to Cairo, all on British-controlled land. Enter Horatio Herbert Kitchener. Born in 1850, Kitchener had been commissioned in the Royal Engineers and had, as a captain, been seconded to help reconstruct the Egyptian army back in 1883. Nominally reporting to the Egyptian Khedive, the army was commanded by British officers. Following the failed Gordon relief expedition, Kitchener had cut his teeth as the governor of Suakin, the Egyptians' sole remaining toehold in Sudan on the Red Sea coast. There he'd fought his first action at the Battle of Handub, before going on to command the Egyptian cavalry at the Battle of Toski, where a Mahdist invasion of Egypt had been defeated. By 1896, he'd spent 13 years in the country, was fluent in Arabic, and had worked his way up to become Sirdar, or Commander-in-Chief of the Egyptian army, with the local British Army rank of Brigadier. He knew the country, he knew the enemy, and most importantly, he knew exactly what he was up against. The man had developed what can only be described as a masterpiece of military planning. A 3-year campaign to destroy the Mahdist regime in Sudan. Year 1, occupy Dongola. Year 2, build a railway through the desert to link to Abu Hamid on the Nile. And Year 3, the final advance and capture of Khartoum. Methodical, logical, and utterly ruthless in his efficiency, Kitchener would be nicknamed the Sudan Machine. At this stage, his Anglo-Egyptian army numbered about 9,000 men, but it wasn't a British army. As Sirdar, Kitchener commanded an army comprised of Egyptian and Sudanese troops, merely with British officers. The reason was simple. Egypt was technically a semi-independent country within the Ottoman Empire. It was the Egyptians, not the British, against whom the Mahdi had risen against in his revolt. In reality, however, it was the British who were in control in Cairo. But nevertheless, politically, the British government wanted it to be seen as an Egyptian campaign. And Egyptian troops were cheaper than British troops, and they were accustomed to local conditions. And therefore, the British could take a hands-off, cost-free approach to this reconquest. Throughout Kitchener's 3-year campaign, the Egyptian flag flew alongside the Union flag, and often alone. On the 18th of March 1896, Kitchener's main army moved from Wadi Halfa on the Egyptian border to a forward base at Akasha, arriving 2 days later. For the next 2 months, he built up his forces. Despite the desire not to be overtly involved in the campaign, the British government did sanction a small British regular contingent to accompany the Sirdar's army. The largest was the North Staffordshire Regiment, 912 men arriving from Malta at Wadi Halfa at the end of March, and there they languished for nearly 2 months. With rumours circulating of starvation and desertions in the Khedive of Sudan's Mahdist, also called Dervish, army, the men of the North Staffordshires feared that they would never even see any action. Eventually a small contingent from the North Staffs, comprising a Maxim battery under Captain Goldfinch, were ordered to march to Kitchener's forward base at Akasha, 70 miles further up the Nile. They were accompanied by men from the 2nd Battalion Connaught Rangers, the other regular British unit present at the Battle of Firket. British soldiers, including the seconded officers in the Egyptian army, accounted for 10%, if that, of Kitchener's invading army. Kitchener's first objective in his plan to secure the Dongola region was to seize the village of Firket, just under 20 miles to the south. Firket itself was a small fortified village on the banks of the Nile, occupied by 3,000 Mahdist warriors. Commanded by Emir Hamouda Idris, he had done nothing to prevent Kitchener building up his forces a little way down the river. And this inaction had led the Khedive in his capital at Omdurman to send a replacement, Osman Azrak. Described as a fanatical follower of the Mahdist cause, he had fought at Toski and survived, and then spent the next 8 years conducting what can only be called a brutal campaign on behalf of the Mahdist regime in the Nubia region of northern Sudan. Kitchener was now faced with a tactical dilemma. He could approach Firket either through the desert or along a narrow track by the river, so narrow that in places men would have to march in single file. His solution was simple. He decided to divide his force into 2 columns and use both approaches simultaneously. The infantry division, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Hunter, would march along the Nile to attack from the north. Hunter, like Kitchener, was another seasoned professional. Commissioned in 1874 into the 4th King's Own Royal Regiment, he was a veteran of the Gordon Relief Expedition and battle-tested at Toski. Hunter's division was organised into 3 infantry brigades. Brigade 1 under Major David Taffy Lewis of the Cheshire Regiment. Brigade 2 under Hector MacDonald, the son of a Scottish crofter who would go all the way to become a general, and whose story I have told on a previous occasion. And Brigade 3 under John Maxwell of the Black Watch. Each brigade comprised of 3 battalions. MacDonald's were all Sudanese, made up of opponents of the Mahdi, in particular from what is now South Sudan. Maxwell's was all Egyptian, and Lewis's was a mixture. The mounted column under Major Byrne Murdoch consisted of 6 squadrons of Egyptian cavalry, the Camel Corps, and a battery of horse artillery, commanded by a Captain Young on secondment from the British Army, and also the North Staffs with their Maxim machine guns. About 2,000 men in total, which also included the 12th Sudanese from MacDonald's brigade, who would ride camels but fight as an infantry. Byrne Murdoch received very specific orders. Occupy the hills southeast of Firket village by 4:30 a.m, and then dispose his force facing west, with the cavalry on the left, the Camel Corps in the centre, and the 12th Sudanese on the right. Kitchener specifically warned him not to come under fire from his own infantry attacking from the north. The timing of the operation was kept secret by Kitchener's intelligence chief, Reginald Wingate, and his deputy, Rudolf von Slatin. Cavalry patrols around Akasha kept civilians away from the preparations. And then fate intervened, as it often does in warfare. On the afternoon of the 6th of June, just as Kitchener's troops were preparing to advance, Osman Azrak himself led a camel patrol from Firket to have a look at the British positions and see what was going on. But would you believe a dust storm blew up, preventing him from seeing the imminent preparations for departure? He returned to Firket, believing that no attack was coming. As it was, at 3:30 p.m. on the 6th of June, the infantry began their march from Akasha. Lewis's brigade led, followed by MacDonald's and then Maxwell's, with the field hospitals bringing up the rear. They were also accompanied by that small detachment from the Connaught Rangers, who, like the North Staffs accompanying the cavalry division, would operate a Maxim machine gun. It took a full hour for the entire column to clear camp. 2 hours later, the mounted column moved off through the desert on their separate route. The river track was treacherous, rocky ground so narrow that only 4 men could pass abreast in places. And in the darkness, men and gun mules stumbled and tripped. There was no moon, and the infantry advanced in complete silence, with orders to bayonet any enemy they encountered, rather than risk a shot alerting the garrison. At 10:30, Lewis's brigade finally reached a sandy plain about 3 miles from Firket. Kitchener made the decision to halt and bivouac. Men refilled water bottles from the Nile, animals drank, and a little food was consumed, and then everyone lay down to rest. Despite the difficult terrain and the fact that the 12th Sudanese had never ridden camels before, the mounted division reached their position at 2:45 in the morning. Meanwhile, at 2:30 a.m, the infantry were on the move again. The great mass of Firket mountain, over 500 feet high, created yet another bottleneck between itself and the river. Nearly 6,000 men had to trickle through this gap in single file, in complete darkness and silence. That Kitchener got his entire force through without mishap or detection speaks volumes both about the discipline of his troops and the quality of his planning. As they emerged from the narrow space, dawn was breaking. Kitchener now positioned his field guns ready for the attack, 1 battery on the left, 1 on the right. Rising ground concealed Firket village itself, which was about a mile away. Then they heard drums. Men looked into the half-light, waiting for the Dervish charge. It never came. The drums were not an alarm signal, but merely calling the Dervish warriors to morning prayer. At 5 a.m, with a blue sky above them, Kitchener gave the order to advance. Suddenly from the mountain, a single shot rang out. Dervish scouts had finally spotted the massive army assembled before them. They were immediately cut down by the Maxim machine gun fire, and the horse artillery now opened up on the village. In the town, the dervishes were caught completely off guard. They'd just finished morning prayers, when suddenly they saw enemy troops up on the mountainside. Armed with their Remington rifles, they rushed to defend their positions. The village stretched nearly a mile along the bank of the River Nile, and about 300 yards inland. On the landward side were tents and straw shelters for the Mahdist army. Meanwhile, mud walls and loopholed houses strengthened the northern defences of the village. Running inland was a low rocky ridge, topped with Islamic flags and defended by stone breastworks. The 10th Sudanese, reaching the crest first, opened fire as soon as they could see the village. To their left, the rest of MacDonald's brigade moved over the ridge east of the town, taking a flanking position. Lewis's brigade advanced towards the riverbank, with the 3rd and 4th Egyptians deploying on either side of the leading regiment. At exactly the same time as the guns from the infantry column had opened up, so too had the ones with the cavalry column. It was an incredible piece of precision timing. As MacDonald moved left and Lewis right, Maxwell's brigade filled the centre, forming the advancing infantry line into a perfect crescent. With horse artillery continuing to fire from the south, MacDonald and Maxwell began their enveloping movement. When MacDonald's advancing Sudanese were about 200 yards from the Dervish defences, 50 Baggara horsemen galloped from the town, led by the former garrison commander, Hamoud Idris himself. MacDonald allowed his troops to fire independently rather than in volleys, but their training was so good that the effect was like a coordinated volley. Not a single horseman survived. The Dervish defenders, shocked at seeing their old commander and his cavalry wiped out, abandoned their first defensive ridge and fell back on another one behind it. MacDonald's Sudanese troops gave chase. Several hundred Dervish warriors fled the village, including Osman Azrak. Some ran along the riverbank, others swam to the opposite shore. The foreshore at the southern end of the village was concealed by steep banks, and the British cavalry commander couldn't see the hundreds escaping. he was also conscious of Kitchener's order to avoid friendly fire incidents. In Firket itself, Dervish warriors emerged from houses and huts with swords and spears, only to be met with Egyptian bayonets. Others remained inside their buildings, firing through the windows and those improvised loopholes. They fought with fanatical courage, but the Egyptians and the Sudanese troops held their nerve and maintained their disciplined fire. The Mahdists fought desperately throughout the village. More than 80 corpses were later found in one group of buildings alone, testament to their determination and the intensity of the close quarters fighting. But by 7:20 a.m, the village was cleared. The battle had lasted under 3 hours, from first shot to final resistance. With the village now in his hands, Kitchener gave the cavalry the order to pursue the fleeing Dervish warriors. And this they did, chasing their enemy all the way to the next settlement of Suada, which they entered the following day. The casualty figures tell their own story. More than 800 dervishes lay dead on the field, with another 500 wounded, and 600 taken prisoner. Kitchener's losses were minimal. 1 British officer wounded, Captain Legg, 20 Egyptian and Sudanese soldiers killed, and a further 83 wounded. There were some remarkable scenes afterwards. Some members of Kitchener's Sudanese battalions recognised old comrades from amongst the prisoners. One of his soldiers even found his father among the casualties. Over 100 Dervish warriors immediately volunteered to fight for Kitchener against the Mahdist state. Meanwhile, local Nubian tribesmen welcomed the Anglo-Egyptian forces as liberators from what they saw as an army of occupation, not least from the retreating Osman Azraq. In terms of scale, Firket wasn't a major battle, but its psychological impact was enormous. For the first time since the Mahdist uprising in the early 1880s, the Egyptians had gone on the offensive in Sudan and achieved complete success. Whilst many of the Sudanese battalions were veterans from the battle at Toski, the vast majority of the Egyptians had never been in action before. More importantly, it was a tactical masterclass. The complex night marches, the precise coordination of 2 separate columns, the swift deployment and enveloping movement all demonstrated the skill and discipline that would characterise Kitchener's entire campaign. There's an interesting footnote for uniform enthusiasts. The North Staffordshire Regiment wore khaki in this battle, but some sources claim that the Connaught Rangers fought in red tunics. And if that's so, it would be the last time that British troops ever fought in red tunics, though the Battle of Guinness here in Sudan in 1885 was definitely the last time that British troops wore them into battle en masse. After Firket, Kitchener again paused to consolidate, bringing 4 gunboats and 3 steamers through the second cataract on the River Nile. Now this required waiting for floodwaters, and nearly 2,000 men spending each day hauling vessels through the swirling rapids. During this period, Kitchener faced a serious cholera outbreak that killed 900 of his men, a sobering reminder that disease remained a soldier's greatest enemy in Victorian campaigns. On September the 23rd, 1896, he occupied Dongola, with a loss of just 1 man killed and 25 wounded. His campaign, Part 1, had been successfully concluded. Kitchener's railway through the desert reached the Nile further upriver on schedule the following year. The final part of his 3-year plan, the March on Khartoum, was successfully achieved in 1898, where his army, now joined by a large contingent of British regular infantry and cavalry, achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Omdurman. One of those regular British cavalry officers was a young Winston Churchill. And meanwhile, amongst the Royal Navy officers in his flotilla of gunboats firing on the Dervish army that morning was a young lieutenant, David Beatty, who would rise to prominence during the First World War. The men who fought at Firket, Egyptian, Sudanese and their British officers, would serve throughout Kitchener's reconquest of Sudan. Following his participation at the Battle of Omdurman, Archibald Hunter went on to distinguish himself during the Siege of Ladysmith in the Boer War, and later by accepting the surrender of 4,000 Boers at Brandwater Basin. He eventually became the governor of Gibraltar and MP for Lancaster before his death in 1936. John Maxwell stayed with Kitchener throughout the Sudan campaign, fighting at the battles of Atbara and Omdurman. Later, he commanded in Ireland after the Easter Rising and died in 1929. Hector MacDonald would go on to play a pivotal role during the Battle of Omdurman, possibly even saving the day. As I said earlier, I've told the story of Fighting Mac in a previous episode, so why not check it out at the end? The Battle of Omdurman started with a full frontal charge by the Dervish army. It was led by Osman Azrak. The man who fled Firket kept riding towards Kitchener's lines until mowed down by withering fire from the army of the Sudan Machine. Whilst Omdurman is remembered in films like The Four Feathers, Storm Over the Nile and Young Winston, the Battle of Firket is largely forgotten. Yet with Kitchener's careful planning, following those 2 night marches, his troops arrived bang on time, achieving complete surprise and an overwhelming victory. The confidence of his Egyptian and Sudanese troops soared, and he had successfully taken the first step on the road back to Khartoum. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story of a little-known battle on the banks of the River Nile in Sudan in 1896. And if you did, please give us a like, and if you want to support my channel, there are ways you can do so in the description below. I'm Chris Green, the History Chap. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing more stories from British history with you very soon.